Brian, good to have you on Out of Consensus.
Thanks for having me, Armin.
So, Brian, you are a full-on global macro guy. You're talking to a lot of funds, institutional investors. You have a background in Austrian economics, so you're looking at the why. You're not only looking at two charts and then like look for the mean reversion, but you're actually analyzing it. What's the reasoning behind it, and how the economy moves? So you have a very interesting hypothesis, and you call it an inflationary equilibrium, that we are entering, or that we are close to entering this inflationary equilibrium. Can you lay out the thesis for us?
Sure. So basically, it's a very similar situation to what happened to the United States and the global economy in the late 1960s and through the 1970s. And that is that inflationary momentum in the economy, once it gathers pace, defeating the inflation requires such a level of economic pain that it becomes politically unfeasible to do.
Right.
And the Federal Reserve is independent, right? In that it's as independent as the political establishment allows it to be at any given time. And definitely steps have been taken that changed it to a certain extent since the 1970s. So it's not quite as susceptible to political capture as it was in 1970 when Richard Nixon named Arthur Burns as the chairman. And he was Arthur Burns. It was later discovered when all the Nixon tapes were released. In a recent series of notes, I listened to a lot of the tapes. And Nixon had the Secret Service put microphones in his desk. And so there's a lot of creaking. You're always hearing as they're shifting around and everything. But these conversations were all taking place, and Nixon knew it, but nobody else did. One of his aides did. And he relied very heavily on Arthur Burns, who was the chairman of the Fed, as a political advisor and as his economic hitman to make sure that monetary policy didn't tighten. And he sent a confidential letter, which was later released in the Watergate trial, to Arthur Burns in late 1971, in the lead up to the 1972 election, that said that inflation, people don't like it, but it doesn't matter for voting. That what really matters is unemployment. And he very much blamed the head of the chairman of the Fed in 1960 for his loss then against John F. Kennedy. And he was very, very heavily pressuring Arthur Burns, do not raise interest rates before April because of 1972. And Arthur Burns carried that into the Fed meetings, right? And part of the relationship between the two was picking people that Arthur knew he could pressure and that would do what he wanted, right? And he even had the FBI investigate leaks by one of the governors who wouldn't just do what he wanted. And so this carried on through the 1970s. So, after Nixon, Burns was able to be a little tighter, right? Because you had Gerald Ford, who was sort of a weak president because he was not elected. He was just named, and he had been the House Majority Leader. And so he ran things like a congressman, not as a president, right? And so he kind of let people do things. If it wasn't, he didn't want to hear about things unless he needed to. So Arthur Burns ran things tighter, right? But it wasn't ever quite enough to defeat the inflation. And as soon as Jimmy Carter came in, right, he said, give me easier money. I want easy money. And Arthur Burns said, well, he was a very dedicated Republican. He wasn't interested in helping Jimmy Carter. And so as soon as Jimmy Carter could get rid of him, he did. And he put in a guy, William Miller, who was the CEO of a company and a very progressive businessman. And he believed that raising it. He was kind of like Erdogan. He believed that raising interest rates could be inflationary, and had this whole crazy idea. Yeah, and so the result was pretty much exactly the same. Was a nasty inflationary mess, and there was a fight between the political loyalists of the Carter administration, including the chairman of the Fed, and the Treasury Secretary, who was saying this is crazy. We need to raise interest rates. So Jimmy Carter fired his Treasury Secretary, put the chairman of the Fed in the Treasury Secretary position because he trusted him. And almost by accident, it ended up that Paul Volcker came in. And Paul Volcker started his tightening, but didn't really achieve it until you had Ronald Reagan, who Paul Volcker hated. So he was perfectly happy to raise interest rates. And did, but actually didn't. That's the amazing thing, is that there's a debate over how disingenuous the monetary targeting was. So in 1979, they started this process because they had been ordered by Congress to reduce the growth rate of money. So to start targeting the money supply in some way. They had started this process, but really jumped into it when they had no other choice in October of 1979, when inflation expectations started going through the roof and you had the oil embargo. They switched over to targeting reserves, and it's, depending on how cynical you are, you can look at it as either they did this such that they wouldn't have to set interest rates at 20%. They could just say, well, the interest rates are 20%, and that's what it is. We didn't do it. The bank's demand for money did. Or you could say that they didn't know how high it could go and wanted to just let the market set it, right? And it was high. They did say subsequently it was higher than they expected it to. They never expected interest rates to go to 20%, right? And it's debatable whether, and so there's whether they didn't think it and the market showed them the actual price, or whether they suspected that it might need to go that high and didn't have the political will to do it, right? Either way, that's how it ended up happening, and it didn't really work. They didn't go all in until there was a president that the chairman of the Fed didn't mind if he got fired. Volcker had a long career working in various parts of government. He was like, whatever, if Reagan doesn't want me, he can fire me. That's fine. And I'll raise interest rates. And so we have definitely entered that period. And what accelerated it, right, in the the COVID thing everybody knows about, but in the United States, the political changes that allowed it to happen was the Biden administration's coup over the Federal Reserve Board in 2022, right? So because of trading activity, right, that was not reported and that was in the past overlooked, 3 of the Fed governors were pressured into resigning, right? So Biden got to name 3 governors in his first year, right? Which normally would take 6 years to get to if everyone were to, all the terms were to, right? So that means, and one of the governors that Trump named is a PhD economist who's a pretty easy money guy. So that means that 4 of the 7 board members, right, not including the chairman, are pretty easy money people, and one of them is definitely easy money person, and 3 of them are directly loyal to Biden because he gave them the job. So Powell is getting pressured by these people, and we are entering an election year, right? They are going to want to cut interest rates to help out Joe Biden.
Just to throw this in, we are recording this end of June 2023. And right now, there are quite a few dovish comments, I would say, or like a lot of market participants would expect, inflation to slow down. There are a couple of hiccups sometimes, like recently there was UK inflation data released, but like overall, I think the expectation is quite clear at this point. So how do we
Well,
kind of, go from like, today where we come from a high inflation environment and now people expect, okay, well, it is probably normalizing somehow. If not like soon, then, a little bit later.
Right. Well, so the inflation measures that I watch that are very, very effective in the United States, for now, at least, right? The relationship between factory inventories and so the ISM factory inventories and customer inventories, the net number. There's still a lot of disruption in the supply chain. There's actually a surprising number of firms that say they have too low inventory, but the number of firms that are saying they have inventory that's too high is up to crisis levels, right? And that feeds very, very directly to factory prices in China, with basically a one or 2 month lag, and those are in deflation, right? So that leads to U.S. inflation with a little bit less than 18 months, say, and we're just about to start hitting the steep decline in inflation pressure that was going away 18 months ago at this time, right? So because of that lag, right, you can see what's coming, and there's about to be a surprisingly fast decline in inflation in the United States as measured, right? And so the Fed has already set up this dovish easing, right? Or a hawkish easing is what they'll paint it as, a hawkish easing, right? Because in this press conference for the June meeting, the economic projections expected that interest rates would start being cut, even though the chairman had said, he didn't really think there would be a recession. And one of the reporters asked about that, and he pointed out correctly, but somewhat mistakenly, that if interest rates are, if inflation rates are coming down, right, then real interest rates will be rising unless nominal interest rates fall, right? So he's saying, oh, well, to stay where we are, right, then we'll have to cut rates. And I think that's important to note because, first of all, everything's based on expectations, right? So by doing that, he's prematurely easing, right? And so I think the fight will be in the Fed will be over how fast to ease, right, to come down and keep real interest rates stable. And they'll be getting a lot of political pressure to do it faster. And the thing is that the labor market remains very, very tight at structural bottom for unemployment, right? So the labor market, this is something I cover very closely. The labor market in the United States has been, and in much of the developed world, has been tighter than tight, as I say, right? So that means that demand is higher than available supply. So that even if demand for labor comes down quite a bit, there still won't be an increase in unemployment because they still need people, right? And so this is the problem with the Fed's, it's a good problem to have, but not when you're in an inflationary equilibrium. And so what I'm expecting is that I've been saying for a long time, we're not going to have a recession because right now, because in an inflationary equilibrium, you don't have the type of credit events that you have in a low inflation equilibrium, right? So when someone is behind, when credit's easy and inflation is running high, right, it's not that hard to just stay ahead of your payments, right? And so that slowdown, that in a low inflation equilibrium, when the economy slows down below its average growth rate, right, all of a sudden people start to run into payments trouble, and there's, they can't just cheat with inflation to stay ahead, right? And so there's a negative momentum, and then the economy falls into recession. You don't have that same situation in an inflationary equilibrium. You get slowdowns when the economy runs out of capacity to grow because there's literally no more, and inflation goes up. And so that's where these stagflationary spikes come from, right? Where growth cannot occur. And so it's strange because it's like, why isn't growth occurring, but real incomes are getting squeezed because inflation is rising. So it feels bad, but it's not a recession. And so that's the mindset that investors and business people need to make that change, because for the next 10 years, we're going to be in this inflationary equilibrium where if there is a recession, it'll be because you have a nasty external shock, like a war that causes natural gas or oil prices to spike, right? Now, I'm not saying that there won't be a recession during this 10-year period, but there definitely will be, and there probably will be in 2024. But it won't happen the same way that it would have during that low inflationary equilibrium period, where bringing inflation down to its stable rate is not a difficult thing to do, and they're more worried about preventing recession than they are about preventing inflation.
Do you see this playing out in the US only, or is this like UK Eurozone phenomenon? We talk a lot about like the political side, on the Fed. But like, do you see this in Europe, Eurozone as well? I guess it's slightly different in China, Japan, but
well, I think Japan's probably the one place that could benefit the most from this, because if they have the Bank of Japan actually has the best handle on the situation, and therefore is perhaps best positioned to make the best of a bad situation, right? So that remains to be seen. But I do think that inflation volatility is a global phenomenon, and that's for two reasons, right? One is that the United States is a major source of monetary stimulus and instability, right? So you just have that natural factor that global real interest rates are going to be affected by what the Fed does. The second factor, and this we'll have to see how this plays out, right? There's definitely a movement towards a dividing of the world, right? Between a Russia-China axis, Russia-China-Iran axis, a global South that has the natural resources, many of the natural resources, and the Western countries, right? And the United States, as it did during the Cold War, would serve as much of the natural resource provider for sensitive natural resources. We have those things. We just stopped digging them up, right? And so, that's definitely one thing that I'm focused on with my clients is mineral rights in the United States. So, I mean, and keeping a lookout for when the federal government decides it's time to start tapping its reserves of rare earth elements and things. There's the state of Nevada is 85% owned by the federal government, right? Wow. And there's a very high correlation between army bases and mineral deposits, right? So they're right on top of those things, and if they need them, they'll go get them. And they'll pay a private sector company to do it for them. And so these are the things to keep a watch out for. So if that were to occur, right, then you have that's a real inflationary issue, because then you have a need to rebuild the distribution of the natural resources, right? How that all gets done, right? Already with the diesel supply chain has gotten all stretched out and needs to be that's a big upside bet for me. I think that the diesel market's going to have a blowout like the container shipping market did in 2021. I think the next inflationary impulse that we have, you'll probably see the diesel market involved. And so, these are the things that I'm looking out for with my clients. And it's, how to think about what does the economy act like in an inflationary equilibrium. And it's a different thing from the great moderation that people experienced during the 1990s and 2000s up until 2019, really.
And it is obviously like you mentioned, it's a long-term thesis. It's a long-term play. Like, what kind of opportunities do you see? How do you position yourself
Yeah.
and they're obviously like different players, but like, what can we expect?
So I think that the key to understanding an inflationary cycle is that standing still, right? You can make money, but not stay ahead of inflation, right? So interest rates will get you maybe even 20%, but that might not be enough, right? So you have to find what the fastest runner is to stay ahead of inflation, right? And so you have to find where that red hot center of the inflationary spike will be, right? And so we got to see a very a great example of it just in 2021 and 2022, right? The container shipping market, the diesel market, all around it, right? Each time there will be different things, right? And that's a key aspect to remember, where that the like locus of the inflationary wave, right? There are common things. I mean, it's probably going to be somewhere in energy and food, right? But what exactly where that ends up is something you have to watch for and watch as it develops. And you'll get an inflationary speculative frenzy in one area or another. And that's where you put the money in and let it sit for a year or two while it explodes upwards, and then walk out, because understanding that then is going to collapse in, right? Because it's not a sustainable equilibrium that you keep, inflation at 20% for 10 years. That's not how it happens. It's up to 20 down to 6, up to 20 down to 8, right? And the average is moving up over time, and we will see how the United States ends up dealing with it. It took a lot of political will and an accident of history almost, that you had a chairman and a president that really disliked each other and were both very forceful personalities. So, we were fortunate in that way. And how long until that happens, I don't know. But in the near term, it's a very, very politicized board that's going to be cutting interest rates faster than people expect. And so, you can make money directly by speculating on the path of interest rates. But you can also and should be very cognizant of how the flows of money you're going to run into, limitations on resources. And so, what are the things that people must have? And it's generally energy, right? It's not something you can substitute, right? If you're going to do something. So you're always looking for non-substitutable, low elasticity items that people will pay anything for, right? And one of the things that's become very interesting is actually in the West Coast of the United States, a majority of the diesel fuel being sold is renewable diesel, which is made with a chemical process from soybeans mostly. It can be a lot of things, but in the United States, it's soybeans. And so there had been for a long time a feedback loop between corn prices and gasoline in the United States, right? Which was powerful enough, and above $8 a bushel or $3 a gallon, they really start to affect each other. That now is also taking place with soybeans, and is because the world uses diesel for transportation more than the United States. That has a much more powerful effect, right? So the draw on food supplies for energy will be a very heavy inflationary force, because what happens is you have if suddenly food prices go up, right? Say either diesel or soybeans go up, right? The other one
affects the other,
stimulates demand for the other, right? Because if the soybean prices go up, you want to have more farm activity, and that uses up more diesel. If diesel prices go up, then they use more renewable diesel, which draws on the soybean prices, which causes more farm activity, which causes more diesel usage. So it's a nasty little inflationary loop that the war in Russia has tightened that global supply of vegetable oils. And so and also created this artificial trade in diesel, where diesel is going from the United States to Europe and then from Russia all the way to Asia. So that supply chain is hugely distended. And just like with the container shipping line and what we're seeing with inflation, measured inflation in goods in the United States, right? When a supply chain gets all distended like that, and you get a lot of inventory on the water, problems happen, right? Because all of a sudden there's too much or too little inventory because of the time that it takes, right? And not only does that affect directly the prices in the markets, but for those goods, but you also have the issue of the pressure on the shipping firms and the inventory holders, because you have interest rates rising, right? At a time when, if you have inflationary pressure, inflation, so the cost of financing that extra inventory that's sitting out there goes from zero to a much higher rate. And it creates a pressure all on its own. And so I just see a disaster waiting to happen in the diesel market. It could either originate from a shock in food prices, or it could cause a shock in food prices. So that will probably be the inflationary story of 2024 or 2025, right? But after, I'm expecting that there's going to be a period of really fast decline in inflation that is surprisingly fast, and that scares the Fed to a certain extent. They're going to say, oh, do we overshoot? Are we going to get a recession? And they're going to cut rates, and that's going to lead to just another inflationary boom. Everything happens slower than you expect it to. Yeah, so sure. It's always right. So I probably, the inflation starts to heat up in early to mid 2024. And the fight at the Fed becomes then, should we raise interest rates right before an election? Uncle Joe says no. Right. And so we'll see. And there'll be another member of the board named by then. Again, this is another thing. I mean, Biden, without reason, he clearly he wanted to add another person to the board and to have someone on deck to replace Yellen. And so he moved Lael Brainerd from the board, who was an Obama appointee. Right. But she was a sound money, sort of lifetime bureaucrat. She was not just some PhD that he had gotten who was a campaign donor, not a major campaign donor, but a partisan. Right. These people are, and so, so he moved her over to the Council for Economic Advisors, basically to keep her on ice. Right, to open up the spot, but keep her around. Oh, I'm not firing you. I'm giving you another job that's, way less important and nobody cares about. But hey,
Brian, I find it to be like a very interesting hypothesis, because it might have it's a very different world that we have been living under, especially obviously pre-COVID, and I guess the repercussions of COVID was also a different world, to a certain extent temporary. So if you think about it now, you've already mentioned a couple of inflation numbers that you are tracking. Let's make the counter case. Like, what data are you watching what would you need to see that would prove your hypothesis wrong, or where you'd say, wow, I think I need to change my mind here?
I mean, it will take a major loosening of the labor market.
Right.
It's a really simple answer. It's no doubt about it. Like, if you get a major loosening in the labor market, then the rate of change of prices, all the things that cause inflationary dynamics to happen, right? Which is cost push pressure on the companies, demand for credit, and the ability to repeatedly raise prices. Those things all go away when people are unemployed, and it takes a little while, right? I mean, it's not just 1 month of 8% unemployment does it. You need a little bit of time for things to ease down, and what that does, the effect that it has, is to create capacity in the economy, right? So that people have second and third lines of production available so that they can say, oh, I'm running profitably and things are good, but Armin just called up and he needs 100, orders of whatever. No problem. I've got that spare production line that I can start up without having to, raise prices and cause these problems. And so that just takes a bit of time and a bit of capacity for businesses to be able to work out for that capital structure, right? To set itself. So one of the things that, we might have run into this inflationary problem eventually, but COVID caused a change in the labor force, right? In the size and composition of the labor force. So the capital structure no longer matched up so closely with the labor force that was using it, right? So that's going to take time and capacity, right? People have to install new machines, right? Old machines need to be taken out and recycled, right? That takes workers. And so unless you have the capacity to do that, the economy's capital structure cannot restructure itself and the inflation persists. And that's why you need a major recession where people can change the literal machines, right? And the structure of the economy can be adjusted to that new labor force. So until that happens, and it will take political will.
People don't like pain. People don't like pain.
No, they don't.
Okay, Brian, that was great. When apart from Cassandra, where can people follow your work?
Sure, that's great. So the Capitalist Pig Collective on Substack is where the sort of retail offering where people can read about the market and some Austrian theory, and they can also check out via LinkedIn. Intertemporal Economics is the name of my firm, and you can get in contact with me through there or email info@acrosstime.net and talk about a subscription.
Fantastic. We're going to link it all in the show notes. Brian, thank you so much for this. It was great.
Thanks very much, Armin.